Well, hello, Karl. Welcome to Mindset.
Hey, Mark. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Appreciate
welcome
it.
to the Mindset Factory.
Yeah, it's awesome. I love it.
It's where we build mindsets.
How appropriate.
Yeah. So we are talking about your latest creation, your new book, Action First Learning.
Yes.
So we're going to dive right in. So talk a little bit high level. We'll talk a little bit about the framework in a bit, but talk about Action First Learning, what it is.
So Action First Learning is the idea that when we walk into a learning experience or sit down for a learning experience, we're doing something right away. So a lot of times in these experiences, we spend a little bit of time on concepts, background, we spend time on learning objectives, and we're halfway through the content before we actually do something. So I got kind of frustrated with that, and I said, let's build a framework that I know works and that people can leverage in the instruction that they build.
So for everybody who reads the book, you'll get to hear a little bit in the preface about the story. It's a beautiful story about kind of eye-opening moment for you, right, in your experience as an L&D. So grab the book and you can read a little bit more about that. So I always like to ask the question of why now? Like if we think about was there a moment where, and let me back up a little bit because I do know from knowing you for 20-some, almost 30 years now, it reads a little like, hey, it only took me a year to write the book, but it really took me 25 years to prepare to write the book, right? Because it's kind of like there's a lot of you in this book over the years, and we'll talk a little bit about that framework, and I think people will understand why. But there's also this kind of but why now, right? Is it beyond that it was I just now kind of see the need to framework a lot of these things that I've been doing, or was it an all call from the industry? Was there a sign?
Yeah, there was a number of things going on. So one was, I was originally going to call the book Beyond Gamification. So let's move beyond gamification to get to some really impactful elements. But the other thing was, with the advent of AI, we're seeing a lot of content being created very rapidly. And some of that content, as you know, is not good content, it's just content. And so I was getting a little bit worried that if we're just spitting out content, we're not going to be able to actually have the learning impact that we want to have. And I knew from my experience of designing games, both digitally and analog games, doing gamification, that when people were actively involved, that's when the light bulbs went off. That's when they said, aha. That's when they kind of got it. So I saw the convergence of those two things happening. The book also came about because, I've been recently having a fascination with Action First comics, Action Comics. And I'm like, oh, that'd be kind of cool because Superman on the cover with lifting. And I'm like, that represents to me doing something in a learning environment. And if you can learn, passively through video or whatever from the best people in the world, why would you then come together, or why would you create something special where people were doing something? And the reason for that is because there's all these connections that we can make if we do something first. And so that was kind of the idea behind, the impetus behind the book.
And did you coin the phrase?
I think I did, yeah.
I think you did.
Yeah, so there's
You're going to tell everybody you did.
Well, yeah, I did. But there's a lot of activity-based learning and things like that. And one of the things that I was worried about was if I took a phrase like activity-based learning and used it, us academics are very strict in our operational definitions. And so another academic would say, well, Karl, that's not really activity-based learning. And I wanted something that was accessible to practitioners. So, the cover of the book is very fun. A colleague of mine, Kevin Thorne, did comic book illustrations. In fact, we're having a coloring book released to go with this book.
Ooh, yeah.
So very excited about that.
Yes.
But the whole idea was it's approachable, but it's deeply researched, as you said, my 25, 30 years in the field. And so it gives you practical skills of how to set this up. A lot of people will come to me and say, Karl, I want to do card game, board game, AR, whatever. I just don't even know how to get started. What do I do? And so the book has examples, the book has tips and techniques, and it has a roadmap of, okay, if you're going to build an escape room, step 1 this, step 2 this, step 3 that. So it's very carefully designed to help somebody go to ground zero to a fully operational action first activity.
Well, and I love that you mentioned AI. because we had a firsthand experience here at Mindset with AI, looking at it is easy, almost from a non-L&D professional or non-instructional designer's perspective, to ask AI, hey, I have this group and I want to do something. In our world, because learning events are often short span, like a short lifespan. Maybe it's an hour, 2 hours, maybe half a day. So it's kind of, they get called activities, or they get called icebreakers, right? Things like that, right? So AI will put out this like thing, this set of like, oh, do this, do this, do this. And recently I had an experience where AI was used to create kind of a framework, and then it was kind of handed off to us to really bring it to life. And we really struggled with the fact that a lot of the things that we want to do, kind of like from an action-first learning perspective, are missing from that we needed to add it to it. I will say that it helped us at least understand what the client wanted or kind of believed that they wanted. But in the end...
Or AI told them they wanted.
Well, that's a good point, right? Yeah. But in the end, if you would have seen the action-first experience that we created, it was very different, right, in terms of like the way it was structured and the way that it was put together. But the essence of it, when the client came back and said, "Oh, that was amazing," but so there was this good aspect of using AI, but in terms of like having a framework or having practices to create that action-first learning, it was really up to us, right? So
so I think it's interesting. I think with AI in general, not to get off too much, but if you are an expert and knowledgeable in your field, AI is an accelerator, because you're like, oh, okay, this is great. I know AI says this, but it really means this. And oh, okay, I can take this and work with it and shape it. And okay, I can run with it. If you're a novice and you're not an expert and AI spits, okay, step one, step two, AI is the way to do that. And it misses things. It has those gaps. It has those connections aren't made. So I think it's useful that way. The book also, every chapter has an AI kind of enhanced prompt.
Right.
So if you're going to build an escape room, or if you're going to build a card game, here's a prompt that you can use to kind of help you get along there. So we try to add that expertise to the book, but just relying solely on AI without that expertise, which, if we want to talk long term, which kind of worries me. If you're in high school now and you're using AI to think and to get that information, where are the experts going to come from?
Yeah.
So that's a whole nother.
Yeah. Tune in for that
interview.
podcast later.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's jump back into the framework a bit. Because I think this is, we build frameworks, and in this case, almost like a practice model, right, for a reason. And to walk us through the framework, because I think it's important for us to understand it's not, there's tactics in this framework as well as like goals and like areas of focus, and maybe just walk us through a little bit.
Yeah. So the whole, I'd say the whole model in itself is a strategic look at creating a learning event. But then I wanted to be, as I said, very practical. So the first thing is some kind of a trigger event. So maybe you sit down and you're online, and all of a sudden somebody pops up and says, "We have a problem, I need your help. Come on."
Yeah.
Or you're in a classroom and someone says, "Hey, here's 3 things you need to find. Go find them." Right? So you get people started right away doing something. So that's kind of the
is that like
event.
is that like kind of creating like the scenario, or is it kind of setting the tone?
So I believe, so one of the things that I think is, if you have a group of learners, whether online or in a live event, a live situation, how we start out that instruction sets the tone for the rest of the time we have with them. So, I've been in experiences where the instructor, facilitator did not set a very good tone at the beginning. Then halfway through, they're like, "Okay, let's get up and do this." And everybody's like, "No way.
Yeah.
I'm not. There's no way."
Yeah.
And these same people, though, if you take them into another experience and you start off with activity and action and something they have to think and make decisions right away, then they're primed to do that for the whole learning event.
Yes. Yeah.
So we just, I think, too often stifle that will for action.
Yeah.
And even online learning, we'll do a module, and the first 50 screens are like read and repeat and click, and then you're like, okay, now let's do a branching scenario. And you're like, no, I don't want to do that.
Well, let's dive in this a little bit, because I think what you just said is really important. And I think I said thank you for coining the phrase action first learning, because I think at Mindset, one of our key things to do is this kind of activity. We didn't necessarily always know what to call them, right? And as I mentioned before, kind of bridge this event space with learning events and learning experiences. So we've tended toward hearing people talk about doing an icebreaker at a learning event or a summit or conference or meeting. But that to me was never enough. But I think the key thing that I'm hearing you say too is there's like this, let's say we go in degrees. Like there's an amount of like you enable or you create the environment through the trigger. And there's a connection to the future learning, right? Or the learning is going to happen. And I tend to think that it's better to have that deeper trigger, and even if the learning connection is a little less obvious in the beginning, it's better to do that than attempt to have a whole deep set of like bombard them with the learning with a little bit of action or a little bit of engagement.
100%. So the people that design the instruction, we care about the theory and how it all works together. And we try to share that enthusiasm with the learner who doesn't care.
Yeah.
If they don't see the learning right away, there's a couple things that can happen. One is they're wrapped up in, if the event is action focused enough, they're caught up in it.
Yes.
It doesn't matter.
Yep.
Second, if you can give them, hey, bear with us. This is going to come to a learning experience. And those two things can happen, and they often happen. And so if we, however, spend a lot of time about the learning theory and it's just too much for them.
Yeah.
And the idea is, so when you have this event trigger action, then you apply the knowledge. At the end of the model is the idea of reflection.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times I think what the problem is with, activity-based learning or whatever we do in the classroom sometimes, or again online, is that people don't always stop to reflect. And a lot of times as designers of instruction or people, we maybe naturally reflect a little bit more than others or whatever. We assume, this person will reflect on this experience, so everything will be great.
Yeah.
And that does not happen.
No.
If we don't build systematic reflection into the event, then if it happens, it's by luck or happenstance, not by design. And we're not called instructional designers for not designing. So we need to design the experience. And so that's kind of the whole idea is that, you have the trigger event, you have, it could be play a game, it could be answer a question, it could be whatever. Then we apply that knowledge and then we deeply think about that knowledge as we're doing it. And then we reflect upon what we've learned. And that model, I think, is like you said, there weren't a whole lot of terms or phrases that kind of encapsulated all of that. And so that was a part of the book too, is how do I get that term out there for what we're doing? And the icebreaker or
so networking opportunity,
or opening item. I mean, if you want to see a room get uncomfortable, tell them, hey, we're going to do an icebreaker. Who wants to go first?
No, nobody.
I don't.
Yeah. Well, and so there's an interesting aspect, I think, of the framework too, around how we can apply the framework over time. And I think that's an interesting conversation because I see it, and you correct me, but I see like if your learning event or learning experience is a 4-hour class, one way of approaching the framework is you could take this framework and apply it as if it's across 4 hours. The other way to look at it would be if you take your 4 hours and break it into segments, that you could take the entire framework and apply it to segment 1, segment 2, segment 2. That's my sense.
No, you're absolutely right. And probably, depending on the content, that's probably a better way to apply it than to apply all at once.
Right.
And I also co-wrote the book with Robin on microlearning. I definitely believe that small chunks can be highly effective. Yeah. And also, I think one of the mistakes a lot of people make is exactly that. Like, okay, we're going to teach, the entire sales process. And so let's teach the whole thing, 4 hours, et cetera. When actually you should be teaching opening, closing, overcoming objections, do it that way, then put it together.
Yeah.
So trying to sometimes put together a huge learning event with this model or this framework or any framework is not necessarily the best way to do it. But exactly, apply it to smaller pieces. And sometimes people don't understand that.
Yeah.
And they get confused, like, well, why are we doing these little things? But at the end, you kind of add them up, and it goes, I got it. Okay, it's I hate to use it, but it's the old Karate Kid, right? Wax on, wax off, down, down, and then all of a sudden now you're doing karate.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's the idea.
Yeah. So pieces of framework, we dove into the bigger thinking. So talk a little bit about some of these major. I don't know what do you call them? Are they techniques? Are they strategies to implement the action first?
Yeah, I think they're methodologies or approaches.
Okay.
So what I wanted to do with the book, so I had the framework of action first learning. I was talking about it, and then people say, well, how do I do that? Like, what do you mean action first learning? So okay, what's a trigger event? What do you do first? So I said, okay, well, let me look at my toolkit from the last X number of years. It's been a while, as you pointed out. Thanks, Mark. But the years, and say, what kind of tools have I applied in these situations that use an action-first learning approach? And then why did I apply those tools? So there's 9, I call them learning experience designs, and you basically can choose it. This is an interesting book for me because this is the first book I've written that is more of, it is not meant to be read linearly.
Yeah.
So you read the first chapter, and then you can decide, hey, do I need to do a card game? Do I need to do, et cetera? I mean, a lot of people, I think, in the last chapter, I laid out a map of, if it's this kind of learning outcome that you're looking for, and you have this kind of situation, then this is the design you want. Now you can go back to that chapter, maybe it's chapter 5 or 6 or whatever, and use that chapter to do that. So that was kind of the approach to the book was, how do I take these experiences that I've had, I've designed, I've implemented, and make it accessible to anybody that wants to implement it?
Yeah. Because one of the things you talk about card game, right? So it's one of these components or one of these methodologies is play a game, right? So you have this trigger, then you can play a game, and so I want to talk about that a little bit because you do mention in the book, which I think is absolutely fair, like gameplay and playing a game. Applying game elements to learning has really made its way into L&D. And at the same time, it makes me think, however, but we kind of do need a framework. And so, is there a sense of we still need a little bit of value add, like reasons why these things work, so that maybe the non-L&D folks, like the decision makers or those who in the L&D field, they need to be able to tell the story about why a game or why we're going to do this, that they say, look, it's part of our framework, and it adds value so that the decision maker or the leader of the organization can say, oh, I get it now. Is this part of kind of giving a little bit more value conversation to the...
Definitely.
Yeah.
So a number of things. So while I think L&D has embraced, games, for example, we're using that, L&D folks have definitely more than ever before. Not 100% saturation, but definitely. But sometimes people outside of that are like, no, just tell me what I need to know. Just give me the SOP or whatever. I don't need all this other activity and stuff like that. It turns out, interestingly, some of the research on action learning is some of that build the framework off of has shown that learners are really poor arbiters of whether or not they've actually learned. So one of the things that I thought the most interesting study, they did the study with active learning, and there's been huge meta-analyses that show active learning is effective. One of like 225 studies in STEM, and very effective. And but when they asked the learners, they said, okay, did you learn more in traditional instruction or did you learn more in action-based instruction? Almost all of them said, oh, definitely traditional instruction. That's better for learning. I learned a lot more. Then they assess them and find out that's not true at all. In fact, you learned a lot less in traditional learning. You just thought you knew more, but you didn't. So it's kind of like I like we both went through building experiences recently. I like it to building. Like if I watch Maine Cabin Masters and I don't know how to build anything, I might say, oh yeah, I can build a building, no problem. Well, how come? Well, did you ever pick up a hammer? No. but I've watched 100 main cabin masters, so I know how to jack and level, right?
Yeah.
No,
yeah.
I don't.
No.
So the idea, sometimes contractors don't even, we've had that. But so the idea is that you can't just sit and get instruction. You actually have to do something. And even though you feel like you learn this, and they postulate, actually, this is interesting, in that learning by doing is harder. It takes more effort. You can't daydream. You have to be applied at the moment. And when you do that, it's hard work.
Yeah, yeah.
And people go, wow, I worked really hard. I don't know what I got.
Yeah.
And so you think, got it. And then some of the problem is we're not reflecting. Like, if you do that, then you've got to give the learner a chance to reflect that, oh, yeah, I did learn this. Oh, wow, that's fantastic. Yeah. I do action-first learning kind of in my graduate program, where I form students into teams, give them a mock request for proposal, kind of do all that kind of stuff. And I'll have students like years later come back and go, oh, Dr. Kapp, like that course, I learned so much in that course. But if I ask them right when they're done, how much, yeah, it was good, I learned, but then it sinks in later on. Oh my gosh, I learned how to do that. I learned how to do that. Yep. So that's where actually having them do those activities, those action-first experiences, that really gets the learning going. And the other thing I want to point out is the 9 that are in the book are not the definitive. They're 9 out of a huge galaxy of action-first learning items. And what I would hope is more people would add, like, oh, here's my action first. Oh, here's my action first. Here's my action first. So it's just a small subset of what's actually available.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's interesting is if you think about simulations, right? If you think about simulation, I'm going to go back to that first comment where I said it's better to have a lot of the activity with a little piece of that tied to the learning. And the reason we see that being more powerful is that a lot of times that little piece of the learning is where we can spend more time on the attitudes and thoughts and behaviors, specifically attitudes and thoughts of the learner, that we know that if we can just get those to start to shift, that then the rest of the day, when we do more what would be like skills-based or knowledge-based or looking at a ton of information, if we spend a little bit of time getting their head in the right thought space or the right attitude space, right, then the other pieces can be
more easily fit in.
More easily fit in.
You're moving their schema.
Yes. And I think that plays into this idea that they think that they've learned less because we oftentimes are in a non-absorbent kind of learning mode where our thinking and our attitudes about our learning are not open enough. We use a phrase that when we do the action-first learning, it's like doing a controlled burn in the forest. And what that means is that, like, if people come into a room, right, they're like that thick undergrowth where their thoughts about what they're there to do, the thoughts of the day, the family life afterwards, the boss that they just had an argument with, like there's this really thick, dense undergrowth that literally keeps the forest from growing. And so a slow burn is like we get rid of all of that. But I think we generally walk around with a very thick undergrowth.
Yeah, and I love that metaphor.
Yeah,
that's
right.
Fantastic. Yeah.
No, thanks. You can use it in your next book.
Okay.
And it makes learning into something more arduous, which then gets interpreted as I learned more because I had to like battle to learn more. I think there's some research in there that we should look at together.
Definitely.
Maybe so I'll help you with the next
one. Okay.
So let's talk about that a little bit because then that gets into this idea of because these environments may be unpredicted by the learner, there can be this idea of confusion. How do we mitigate that confusion? How do we kind of get them so that it's like that they don't feel out of place or displaced or lost from the very beginning?
Right. So there's a couple ways to do that. So one is, we talked about this earlier too, is make it a safe space. So you got to make sure that they can fail comfortably, that failure is an option, and then it's not too dramatic. But then also showing them that you're, if it's a classroom kind of environment, showing them you're comfortable with a little bit of chaos.
Yeah.
If it's an online experience, sometimes just letting them know, like you might be a little confused, just move forward. A lot of times we forget that adult learners already bring some knowledge with them. Yeah. So sometimes by starting at ground zero, we actually alienate the learner because they're like, oh, come on, I already know all this. Yeah. So I mean, you're not going to teach me anything I don't know. Yeah. So I'm a proponent of putting the learner in a situation where all of a sudden they know they don't know something. And they're not necessarily comfortable with that. But the researcher Malcolm Knowles said that adult learners learn best when they know they don't know something. So I think oftentimes we need to put them in a situation where they realize, oh, I don't know something. Okay. Because now you're going to be much more receptive and open to the learning process. So what we need to do as designers of these experiences is make sure that they feel safe, make sure that the logistics are worked out, make sure that like one of the mistakes that we like to make is, okay, we're going to do this big action first learning thing, but here's 450 rules that we're going to follow before we get started.
Rules.
And you know, who likes that? Like, I don't like that. Nobody likes that.
Yeah.
So the idea there is to just get them in doing something, and then unfold the rules as you go on. So really interesting. I was playing this really interesting game the other day. It's about investing and teaching you really the importance of diversifying and all that kind of stuff. And so you first, it's just a savings account, and you invest in a savings account. By the end of the game, you're investing in commodities and foreign exchanges and all that kind of stuff. But they don't give that to you all at once. It's too much. Yeah. They go, okay, here's a savings account. Here's an individual stock. Here's the stock market. Now here's a commodity. Now here's crypto. You know, it kind of builds up. And so when we design these events, that's what we want to do. A little small piece, smaller, and bigger, bigger, and bigger, and bigger. Then we've got them, right? You're in this situation. Yeah. And sometimes we can use action first designs from commercial for learning. So lots of people know what an escape room is, their experience with escape rooms. So we don't have to explain, you know, you have to get out in an hour. Card games, we all know what deal means, shuffle means, all that kind of stuff. We all know what a board game looks like. So by leveraging these commonalities, it actually lessens our cognitive overload and allows us to focus more on the experience and less on learning how to act in the experience.
Yeah, and that's good for the designers as well as the facilitators. When you think about if you're facilitating something that has maybe been designed for you, like it's part of a program that you're delivering, that as the facilitator, we can think about, okay, how do I want to deliver? Because maybe you're seeing the whole descriptive action first activity, and you might be tempted to like, I'm going to deliver all the rules first, or I'm going to give them a lot of information, right? As a facilitator, and I'm assuming a lot of this comes from you being an educator as well as a designer, and how you actually bring about these. Is there a synergy?
Yeah, there's definitely a synergy. I mean, it's my experience being in the classroom, you know, teaching, designing online instruction, designing gamification, designing games for people to play. So the interesting thing is, if you design a game, you don't actually design the learning at all. You design the experience in which the learning can occur.
Yes.
So you design the experience in which learning will be facilitated, but you're not actually learning anyone, right? Yeah. So the idea is to bring all of that together, and so that's why you know if something is laid out by a designer, and then you as a facilitator decide to circumvent that, then you're not necessarily being true to what the designer's intent was, assuming best intent, best design, and et cetera. But if we assume that, then you can't just go, oh, well, these people don't know anything about the stock market, or so I'm going to teach them all about it, and then we'll have them invest, right? Yeah. That's not the design of that particular experience. So you got to be careful about that. And then as designers and facilitators ourselves, we have to think about how can we make this happen so that we encourage the learner to want to learn in that situation, or be involved with it, and then have that aha moment. I mean, that's what we really, if we can get that aha moment, then they're so open to learning. And that's when your toughest critic is sitting there like this, have the aha moment, and then they're your staunchest advocate.
Yes.
They're like, yes, let's do this. Yeah, this is great. This is wonderful.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to see that turn. I'm sure the mindset have done it all the time.
Totally. Yeah, we'll do an action first experience, and people generally think about what that session is going to be. For us, it may be what most people call like a typical meeting, or we're going to get people together to do a strategy, or we just recently had a vision session where we're getting a group together to create a vision of a specific region. And there's a lot of preconceived ideas about what that's going to look like, right? It's like, well, we're going to bring all of our ideas to the table. And when we step back and start with an action first learning that says, well, we're going to show you, we're going to open you up, because we're going to do that controlled burn of the forest, and we're going to show you that we need to get you in the right mindset to be able to get to that eventual vision. That this is when people who came in thinking, oh, this is going to be a typical this or a typical that, this is what's going to happen. You're right, because they generally are, especially successful people that have really they didn't do so by ignoring things that work.
Right.
And so what they can immediately see is like, oh, this is going to work. This is different, but this is going to work. And then they do become, they're up front at the end going, oh my gosh, that was awesome.
Yeah.
And they didn't expect that from the beginning. But, and I want to talk a little about the distinction here between learning by doing, and I think there's some misconceptions about that, because we could easily say in some ways we could take positions on opposite end of the fence on this issue, which I know we're not on, but I think you and I can take different perspectives. You could say, I'm all about learning by doing, it's all about the doing, and on my side I could say, yeah, but learning is really about thinking. It's all in a cognitive process, right? So you could sit in a room and think about something. Technically speaking, learning, right, is happening, right? As long as I think about information and change my knowledge, learning happens. On the flip side, then we have this kind of argument, if you will, that it's like, but if you do something and do something and do it again and do it again and do it again and do it again and do it again, that's proof and evidence that we don't learn by doing. Right? Because that's like, I'm just mindlessly doing. Right. And I think what I love about action first learning is it's a merger. It's action first learning. And that to me that's a little system of its own, right? Because it's action first learning. We want to avoid linear thinking, but we also have a language need to put something into a model or in a book that is linear language. And so to me, action first learning is really, it's all together. There's action, you're doing it time-wise first, and the learning is happening. So you're doing while thinking, and thinking first at the right action level. Right.
Yeah, so the idea, so I think of it this way. So if we go back to kind of escape room thought, like I could learn all I need to learn about problem solving and figuring out all that kind of stuff, and sit there and get that information, have the cognitive change. But when I'm in a room, and then get out of the escape room myself. But when I'm in an escape room, all of a sudden you throw another person in there who may think differently, who may approach things differently. Now all of a sudden, my thinking by itself isn't going to work. Yeah. Right? Or it's going to run into obstacles.
Your biases.
Exactly. And so now you have to work together. And not only now am I not just learning what I need to do about the concepts and ideas, but I'm also learning about working with another person. I'm getting that emotional side of it. I'm getting that attitude, affective domain in there as well. So now I'm figuring out how to work with someone as I go through that. And when you think about action first learning, when I think about it, the idea is that you are going through a cognitive process as you're doing something. Like one of the things I wanted to make sure in the book was that we weren't doing action for the sake of action. Right. It was action that was meaningful, action first. So it doesn't just mean like we do action first, but it also means that's what we want to think about, that learning part of it. Yes. And so that idea, so every chapter in the book, I say, hey, if you're going to go after this cognitive outcome, use this design. So for example, you wouldn't use an escape room if you're teaching somebody concepts or categorization or something like that. It's the wrong model. Yeah. It's the wrong way to do it. So I wanted to be sure that if we're going to have the thinking with the action, that it's the right action for the right thinking and merging those two together. And that was a really important part of the book. And I spent, every chapter has like, if you're going to teach if you're using this is what it teaches.
Yes.
So, you don't use Jeopardy, for example, to teach problem solving. It doesn't make any sense. But then neither do you use a big, huge, convoluted scenario to teach terms and terminology, right? So you have to have the right instructional strategy for the right type of action first learning. And so that's where the cognitive comes into it. And I mean, to me, I always think about, when I went to grad school, like behavioralism, cognitivism, constructivism, all those to me were like almost different, a continuum of the same kind of learning. Like we do learn behavior, like when we touch a stove and it's hot, we learn our behavior is don't touch the stove, right? But then we also can watch other people and go, oh, they touched this and got burnt, so I'm not going to touch that either, right? And we're cognitive. We're not doing it ourselves. We're not going to go touch it. We're going to believe that what we saw happen, and then sometimes we're going to build our own knowledge. Well, this is red and it's glowing. Red glowing things burn, so I'm not going to touch that, right? So we kind of can use, I think, all of those knowledge building blocks and theories for how we actually learn.
Yeah. Well, the time always goes fast, but I know this is a great opportunity for folks to get to know about your book that's coming out. This is exciting. So talk a little bit about when it's coming out and where can we get it?
Yeah, great. So it's coming out April 15th. So not far from the publication of this podcast. And it is available wherever you buy your fine books, right? So it's available at ATD, Amazon, and even Barnes & Noble.
Oh, nice.
So lots of really cool places. And I said there's a really cool coloring book that's going to come with it.
Love it.
Well, maybe separately, but you'll be able to get somehow. We're still working that out with the publisher, but an instructor guide. So if you're a teacher or faculty member, there's an instructor guide that I just got done editing that is available that says, okay, here's some discussion questions, here's some quiz questions, reflection questions. So, and every chapter there, as well as the chapters that we have here, start with a call to action.
Nice. Well, thanks for writing the book. Thanks for having this conversation. Thanks for continuing your lifelong quest to make all of us better. So appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Yep.